And this is so common, right? What happens in hero syndrome, and this is especially in startups, but even in companies that are trying to grow, what happens is we're constantly focused on just growth, on being big. And, even our vision, it just turns into growth. It's all about just being big, being ubiquitous. And we lose focus on whose problem are we actually setting out to solve. I was running a workshop for an organization just a few weeks ago, and they have many different personas that they're trying to address the needs of. And this company was having a very hard time defining whose problem are we setting out to solve, because they want to be ubiquitous. And this was really this feeling of, I think you guys have hero syndrome, because you're trying to be big, but this refusal to really focus on whose problem are we going to solve first. It doesn't mean that you're not going to solve everyone's problem over time, but the lack of focus actually gets in the way of being able to do this right. This lack of focus means that we're not solving the problem well enough because we're not focused on the problem and solving it through our product. We're just focused on being big.
Welcome to the Product People podcast, where we learn from amazing product leaders about product management, growth, and product ops. I'm today's host, Mirela Mus, founder and CPO at Product People. Today's guest is Radhika Dutt, author of Radical Product Thinking. She served as advisor to the Monetary Authority of Singapur and Chief Product Officer at MovePrice. This is the first part of the episode with our guest. To have you here.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Same. So you wrote Radical Product Thinking. Can you share with us the journey that led you to writing this book?
Yeah. So my background is that, I've started companies and I've worked in a range of industries. So the first company I started, in fact, was back in the dorm room where I was at MIT. And that's where we started Lobby 7. And in my startup journey, I realized I've made so many mistakes and learned from them, right? Like, I'll give you the example of that first startup, Lobby 7, where we were trying to revolutionize wireless. That was our vision, to revolutionize wireless. And if you ask me, what does that actually mean? I can't even tell you. Like, we knew we wanted to be big, right? But we didn't know what problem we were really setting out to solve. And this is something that happens so often with startups, right? But even with larger companies, it's all about being the hero and being big, where we focus on being big to the point where we lose sight of what's the problem we're solving. And that's one example of a product disease that I encountered. It was called hero syndrome. But, over time, I was part of other startups. And then later I was at larger companies, all the way from multinationals to government agencies. And the thing is, I kept seeing the same pattern of various product diseases that I kept running into. And over time, I learned from my mistakes and had built this intuition for how do you build good, successful products, right? But even though I had learned from my mistakes, as I grew in experience, I then had to watch other people make the same mistakes that I had made in the past. And so the question that came up was, are we all just doomed to having to learn from this trial and error approach? Or is there a way that we can give people a systematic step-by-step process for building products successfully? And that was the thesis behind, like, can we come up with something? And myself and two colleagues, ex-colleagues, we talked about, our frustrations in how we've had to learn through this trial and error and having to watch others make these mistakes. And we said, maybe we can create a framework to help people build products successfully. And that's where this radical product thinking framework was born. And it was at first just a framework that we put out on the website so that people could just download this and use it, right? And what happened was we went and presented this. The first time we presented it at a conference, someone came up to me at the end of that talk and they said, "Oh my God, you guys created radical product thinking." And we felt like mini celebrities there, because it turned out that people had found this by themselves, just organically. And then they had started implementing it. And in fact, this woman had then talked about it at another conference where she said, "Oh, look what I found, and you should try this out." And so that's how radical product thinking was born. And then the need for the book came up because so many people would come to me and say, "Do you have examples of this that's filled out, or examples of how to use this, how to bring it into organizations, etc.?" And so that's why I wrote Radical Product Thinking.
Amazing. And you also mentioned a few concepts that I'm very excited to dive into, like product diseases and the hero syndrome. That sounds so relatable.
Yeah, I'll share a few other examples of product diseases. And I find that, anyone who's been in product, right, they've experienced this themselves or they've seen this happen to others. So let's talk about some of these examples of product diseases. Favorite disease I talk about in the book is obsessive sales disorder. And I say it's my favorite because I have absolutely contributed to this disease myself. Obsessive sales disorder happens when, your salesperson comes to you excited about this potential client and they say, we can win this mega client if you just add this one custom feature. And I promise we'll only turn it on for this one customer. And it sounds mostly harmless. So we say, yes, let's do this, right? And pretty much by the end of the year, there are lots of such custom features and your entire roadmap is driven by all that you have to make good on. So that's obsessive sales disorder. Another really common product disease is pivotitis. So basically pivotitis happens when
Absolutely.
even the name sounds familiar, right? And pivotitis happens both in small companies and large. In a startup, pivotitis looks like, today we have one fantastic idea. Tomorrow it's a different idea that we're pursuing. And we keep switching from one concept to another. And your team just feels like they have whiplash all the time. That's the example at a small company. At a larger company, pivotitis can look like, sometimes I've seen it look like, teams pivoting from one sprint to the next based on whichever customer is screaming the loudest for what they need, right? And so pivotitis can look different in small companies versus large, but it's this effect of people feeling like, okay, we keep changing direction and I have no idea what to do. And I'll give you one last example of a disease. And this is, I think, one of the most common ones at the moment because we all want to be data-driven. It is the disease I call hypermetricemia, which is where we're obsessed, absolutely obsessed with metrics and moving things up and to the right, right? And we want to show all these charts where things are moving up and to the right. But the problem is sometimes we're not even thinking about, are these the right metrics to be measuring in the first place? And so if I were to summarize, and in the book, I do talk about a few more product diseases, and you should definitely check it out. But if I were to summarize, what are these product diseases? What I've found is when we don't have a clear vision and strategy that is driving our iteration, meaning when our everyday actions are disconnected from a clear vision and strategy, that's where product diseases creep in. And the way we avoid these product diseases is, instead of just moving fast, and this is, by the way, what happens with Agile. With Agile, we're all working on moving fast, but we're all moving in different directions. And so if you visualize it, it looked like it's arrows that are all moving in different directions. And it looks like chaos, right? But yet we're moving fast. And so instead of just moving fast, what we really want is moving both with speed plus direction. And that's what radical product thinking gives you. It's giving you that direction so that instead of just speed, we have velocity, so that everyone in the organization, we all look like arrows pointing in the same direction. And as we know from physics, right, what we care about is not just speed. We want velocity. And that's why we need to add this direction. And that's what radical product thinking allows you to do. It gives you a step-by-step process to really define your vision, strategy, how it translates into priorities, into how you measure success, and it helps you align your whole team so that we have velocity.
Hey, if you're enjoying this Product People podcast, check out our weekly live streams on LinkedIn and YouTube. Back to the episode. This is great. Thank you for the examples, and they are very memorable. How about the hero syndrome? You mentioned that at the beginning of your introduction.
And this is so common, right? What happens in hero syndrome, and this is especially in startups, but even in companies that are trying to grow, what happens is we're constantly focused on just growth, on being big. And, even our vision, it just turns into growth. It's all about just being big, being ubiquitous. And we lose focus on whose problem are we actually setting out to solve? I was running a workshop for an organization just a few weeks ago, and, they have many different personas that they're trying to address the needs of. And this company was having a very hard time defining whose problem are we setting out to solve because they want to be ubiquitous. And this was really this feeling of, I think you guys have hero syndrome because you're trying to be big, but this refusal to really focus on whose problem are you going to solve first. It doesn't mean that you're not going to solve everyone's problem over time, but the lack of focus actually gets in the way of being able to do this right. This lack of focus means that we're not solving the problem well enough because we're not focused on the problem and solving it through our product. We're just focused on being big. And that's really what was happening to us when we had that startup lobby summit. But what I keep seeing in organizations whose entire vision is about being big.
And by that, you mean they start out probably as successful in some segments, and then they develop a decent product lines. And at some point, they're this large corporate, let's say in real estate or something, turning to everything from getting a loan to selling your property or renting and getting your credit checks and signing up contracts with your landlord. So everything about that journey, but then that translates into a variety of products from contract management to a marketplace. And then when you ask them, okay, what's your most important customer or what's the most important use case, they are like everything. And then, at least in your opinion, has this worked prioritizing by revenue streams? As at least I could totally see myself in these type of scenarios with a few clients. And at least they were very aware of revenue streams and the potential upside in that specific segment, because in some cases they were not successful at capturing all the value they could. They were either too early there or there was an incumbent that was larger or a variety of reasons. Has that helped focus the conversation? Because it's very easy sometimes at these companies to just divert the conversation to revenue and then people become more attentive to what you're saying.
Great question. So let's talk about two concepts here. One is vision and the other is priorities and how it relates to an organization like this, right? I feel like, what you describe, where a company is expanding and expanding to try to do everything for everyone, right? To me, it reminds me a little bit of the wars Napoleon fought. At some point, we have to realize that the further away we go from home base, the harder it is to fight that war. And so at some point, maybe you do have an army large enough and infinite resources to be able to fight that war effectively far away from home territory. But if you're starting to feel like you are getting stretched, it really is important to come back to, just building a clearer understanding of what exactly is our vision. Now, this is where I think hero syndrome is very easy to set in, because what we've learned about what is a good vision until now is that a good vision is big, it is aspirational. Very often, you hear the term BHAG, which is you need a big, hairy, audacious goal for a vision. What I've realized is so much of that is true bullshit because let's set aside conventional wisdom for a moment. What you really need for a good vision is you need a good vision to act like a filter sometimes, because sometimes you need to be able to say, to be able to hold up a feature against this vision and say, should I do this or not? And sometimes the answer should be no. I want to give the example of a public company that had the vision of pushing forward on human progress by empowering people to express themselves. So this idea of human progress by letting people express themselves, this could be the vision for anything. It could be the vision of a social media company, but it could also be the vision of my kid's piano teacher, because she is empowering my kids to express themselves. And this is absolutely human progress by allowing these people and her students to express themselves. It could be the vision for a company that makes stickers, to a dance studio. I mean, pretty much anything goes, right? And this is why what we really need is not a vision where anything goes, but really something that acts like a filter where sometimes the answer is no, don't do it. And so what do we need in a good vision? It has to answer 5 questions: the who, what, why, when, and how. So the first is, whose world are you trying to change? And it can't be everyone. The second is, what exactly is their problem and how are they solving it today? Then we can ask this most important question, which is, why does the status quo need to be changed? Why is the status quo unacceptable? Because if we cannot answer that effectively, really, there's no reason for our product to exist. Then we can say, what is the world we envision? Meaning, what does the world look like when that problem is solved? And finally, then we can say how. So how are you bringing this about? And so in the radical product thinking way, this is a fill in the blank statement so that we're not in love with our own words. We're not focused on wordsmithing, but we're answering these profound questions so that we have clarity for our team. So that's the first step. So when you describe a company like this, where they're trying to do everything for everyone and we're starting to get stretched thin, first focusing on, okay, what is our vision? What's the change we're trying to create? Then the second step is, what you talked about is, well, focusing on revenues and what brings in the most revenues. I want to challenge that and think about prioritization a little differently. So the way I think about prioritization and kind of what you and I do as leaders, right? What we're intuitively doing usually is we're balancing long-term against short-term. And you're intuitively doing this in your head and you're deciding this is the priority. So let's make this vision versus the short-term explicit. So I make this yin and yang explicit by putting it on an X and a Y axis. So now that you have a clear vision statement that answers who, what, why, when, and how, that's your Y-axis that says, is this good for the vision or not? And then the X-axis is this good for survival or not? So survival is the short term. And so survival in this case for this organization might be revenues, or it might be stakeholder support for your product if you're a product manager and your boss might not approve. And so your biggest danger maybe is not necessarily revenues, but it's, stakeholder support. But think about what is your X-axis in terms of survival? And then you can prioritize based on trade-offs between vision and survival. So something that's good for the vision and is good for survival, well, of course, that's ideal, right? But the harder decisions are things where it's good for the vision, but not good for survival in the short term. So this is what I call investing in the vision. So an example of this is, if you have to refactor code for 3 months, you're investing in the vision. If you're, paying back technical debt, that's investing in the vision. The opposite of investing in the vision, on the other hand, is taking on vision debt. So that's good for survival, but bad for the vision. So do you remember the example of custom features that we talked about? A custom feature is an example where, maybe it helps you win that big deal, but it's taking on vision debt. And so this quadrant, the more vision debt you take on, the more it leads to obsessive sales disorder eventually. And so the right approach to prioritization is finding what's the right balance for your specific organization between ideal, investing in the vision, and vision debt. There's one other quadrant for, completeness I'll cover, which is the danger quadrant, which is bad for vision and bad for survival. But very few people are asking for anything in that quadrant. So it's rare that you'll have things in there. But the idea is there's no right answer in terms of how much should I be investing in the vision or how much vision debt should I take on. The truth is, good products go bad when we don't invest in the vision adequately, or if we take on too much vision debt. So if we're always focused on revenues and we're not investing in the vision instead, that over time erodes our product. So that's kind of the balance that we think about between vision and survival. And by talking to stakeholders about where features fit or where initiatives fit, or even sales opportunities on the vision versus survival, we can help people understand and, create some alignment in terms of how often are we investing in the vision? How often are we taking on vision debt? Maybe it's pushback for, please, let's not take on this vision debt because of how bad it is for our product.
That's a great example. Thanks for listening to this Product People podcast. This was the first part of the episode with our guest. Be sure to check out the second part. If you found it useful, please subscribe and consider giving us a rating. For more info, visit getproductpeople.com and see you next time.